Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Very good evening and welcome to the Al-Ikhlas Academia Library webinar. And our focus tonight, Lebanon, a nation in turmoil. Thank you for joining us. We also welcome listeners and viewers who have joined us via our broadcast partners, the Voice of the Cape on 91.3 FM, CII Radio, Salam Media, and ITV. You can also catch us on the Academia Library YouTube channel and the Facebook page. Now, with the challenges posed by the lockdown regulations in the midst of COVID-19, Al-Ikhlas Academia Library has repurposed the way it reaches out to its audience to fulfill its objectives of informing and engaging. Hence the introduction of the webinars, this being the third in our series. And through this medium, we reach beyond the walls of the library to a global audience. So on to this evening's webinar. The explosion in Beirut on Tuesday, the 4th of August, foregrounds both humanitarian and political challenges with which the people of Lebanon are struggling. To shed light on this important development, we'll be joined by three experts. They'll discuss the immediate humanitarian tragedy following the explosion, the political and economic situation in Beirut leading up to last week's explosion, and events unfolding currently. And to contextualize the Lebanese crisis that has been unfolding for decades, they will focus on the role of the colonials, the origins of the sectarian political system, and the creation of the post-1990 political elite. And we also have a live link up to Beirut later in the program, and joining us from Beirut will be the CEO of Africa Muslims Agency, Imran Chinara, but that will be later. But before we get into the discussion, let us first listen to the story of Dima. Dima lives in Karantina, which is a neighborhood in the northeast of Beirut. She shares how her family was affected by the explosion last Tuesday. And this video was produced by Africa Muslims Agency.
أول شيء صار معنا لما كنا بالبيت كنا كتير مبسوطين الصبح لحد ما صار بعد الظهر كنا هيك مبسوطين وعم نحكي وبنضحك فجأة سمعنا أصوات هيك وصار يمرق إسعاف يمرق إطفاء. نحن توقعنا بالأول حريق بقفل البيت هيك ما توقعنا أبدا رح يكون انفجار. بس صار هزي فتنا لجوا، صرنا نشيل الكهرباء بدنا نطلع ننزل لتحت على الطابق التحتاني يمكن يكون كان أأمن. لسه ما نزلنا، لسه ما طلعنا من باب الغرفة عم نشيل الكهرباء والهيطان هبطت فوقنا. كان أول يوم العيد كنا كتير مبسوطين، ظهرنا من البيت وكنا عاملين أكل عيد طبخين. تاني يوم العيد رحنا على البحرية على الكورنيش، كمان كنا كتير مبسوطين. هيدا حجاب أختي الكبيرة اللي توفت الله يرحمها.
شو اسمها؟
لطيفة. بفتكر هون في جاكيتات كمان. هيدي الأحمر والأبيض مخدة الماما والتخت تبعهم بفتكر. هيدا لأختي جود الصغيرة كان.
شو كانت مسميته؟
مش مسميته، بتلعب فيه بتنبسط فيه.
قد عمرها جود؟
14 سنة. ضل مقهورة بدي أهلي يرجعوا لي. أنا ما بقدر أتخيل حياتي بدون أهلي، هني كل دنيتي. أنا بتعلق فيهم كتير، إذا كل يوم ما كنت شوفهم ما بقدر أعيش. كنت ضليت تحت الحيطان توفيت معهم.
And that was the story of Dima, who lives in Karantina, a neighborhood in the northeast of Beirut. And she shared how her family was affected by the explosion last Tuesday. The video produced by Africa Muslims Agency. And just a reminder to those of you who are tuned in via the YouTube channel, and also all the viewers, there will be a Q&A session, a question and answer session in the second section of the program. But now let us meet our panelists. The three panelists, first, it's Hafid Hussein Chunara. He is the regional manager of Africa Muslims Agency. He hails from a family of humanitarian workers. His late father, Farid Chunara, served as a champion of the poor and the destitute over several decades. Then we have Matshidiso Motswaneng, a researcher with the Afro-Middle East Center, AMAC. She holds a BA honors degree from the University of Johannesburg and is currently completing a master's in international relations. And also from AMAC, the executive director, Naeem Jina. AMAC is a Johannesburg-based research institute dedicated to studying the Middle East and North Africa and relations between the region and the rest of Africa. Naeem previously worked as a director of operations at the Freedom of Expression Institute and taught political studies at the University of Witwatersrand. We're going to kick off with Hussein Chunara, the regional manager of AMA. Hussein, can you sketch for us the humanitarian situation on the ground in Lebanon, particularly, of course, Beirut, where our focus is, the frustration of the people who had already faced food shortages in Lebanon before the explosion, and now the effect of the latest events? What effect has it had on them? And the whole rebuilding program. So what are the humanitarian challenges, Hussein?
I think that's better now. Can you hear me, Brother Farid?
I can hear you. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum to Brother Farid Sayed and of course to all the panelists. And on behalf of Africa Muslims Agency, we want to thank the Al-Ikhlas Academia Library for having us on air this evening to share what is happening right now in Lebanon. And I think, to answer to your question, what's happening right now in Lebanon is, I think all of us saw the blast that has impacted the nation on the 4th of August. And with that, the consequence of that is a humanitarian catastrophe. Our CEO is on the ground, Hafiz Imran Chonara. Our teams have been active since the 4th of August. And what we're witnessing every day is beyond just, someone receiving a food parcel. It is psychosocial support that's required. Families have been displaced. Thousands of people have lost loved ones. Our teams daily walk through rubble of homes where once people have, lived. Just a few days ago, were like you and I in our home, living normally, having supper, and now that's a place of rubble. And when they look at it, they don't just see the destruction of buildings. They see the destructions of families. They see the destruction of their mind. So right now the teams are on the ground. The emergent need, Brother Farid, and to all the viewers out there, the emergent need obviously was food, and still is food and water. You can imagine you're living in a high-rise building with lots of apartments. The one building collapses, that's hundreds and thousands of people immediately displaced with no shelter and no food. So the emergent need right now is food, and the teams are actively, distributing the food aid across Beirut. When the explosions happened, one of the needs then immediately was, of course, mobile clinics. A few hospitals was impacted by the blast, and of course, with the hospital, the medical infrastructure in Beirut overcrowded due to COVID-19. The teams kicked in with mobile units, mobile medical clinics to facilitate the wounded and injured in the streets of Beirut, literally, at their homes, because medical assistance was the need of the hour at that point. And now the need is gone to food and water, where, so that is, and people are facing, literally do not have that on a daily basis. And then thereafter, of course, the projects of the campaigns will then move to rebuilding and, of course, providing psychosocial support on the ground.
Thanks, Hussein. We will come back and talk about the details regarding the rebuilding process, because that is going to be quite a challenge. And I also want to explore further the challenges faced by the medical facilities, because you referred to the overcrowded hospitals, of course, as a result of the COVID epidemic. But we'll come back to that. I want to turn to Matshidiso Motswaneng, the researcher at AMAC. Now, Matshidiso, Lebanon had already been facing an economic and political crisis before the explosion. Now, can you give us an overview of that crisis pre and post explosion? Because one cannot look at what's happening in Lebanon in isolation, the explosion and the story, because there's something that preceded it. So can you just just give us an overview of the crisis so that we have an understanding of the situation on the ground?
Okay, thank you. And thank you to everybody listening and watching. So the Lebanon crisis, the peak or the height of it, we saw when the start of the protests in October 2019. But really the crisis, precedes the October 2019 protest movement. I think since the end of the war, Lebanon has been battling to create a very stable, self-functioning and self-efficient economy, as well as a political system that is able to, put in or reinforce that infrastructure that can hold an economy. In 2017, we could, highlight one of the biggest events that, exploded this crisis was when Saad Hariri traveled to Riyadh and made a public resignation, to which he later withdrew, sat in the government, and then elections were called for 2018. So the 2018 elections, we saw quite, the Hezbollah coalition quite having a landslide victory in the elections, which ushered in a new government. So this new government, obviously made promises for reforms to reform an economy that was largely informal. Half of Lebanese economy is informal, mainly focused on the construction and agricultural sector, which has made it very difficult for government to be able to collect revenue and sustain the economy. part of the other economy of Lebanon is made up of international remittances from expats or Lebanese citizens living outside of the country. So a huge part of the economy has largely relied on this external transfer of funds into the economy, but also largely indebted. The government's physical debt has exceeded over 60% of the GDP. The government has largely failed to pay many of its loans that it usually got from countries such as the Gulf countries and other international donors such as France and the US. Making the situation worse has been years of US sanctions on the country, largely to try and squeeze out the dominant or the growing role of parties such as Hezbollah and their allied members. So 2018 really was the height of the economic crisis and the political crisis. The new government that came in with Saad Hariri still as the prime minister failed to implement much needed reforms to the economy to be able to, facilitate job growth, facilitate, GDP strengthening and economic growth. So in October 2019, we saw the government implementing, capital controls, implementing heavy taxes on things like voice calls, including WhatsApp, and fuel, which obviously put a huge burden on the economy and, people whose incomes already were too stretched to be able to even afford the living standards in Lebanon at the time. So October 2019, protests broke out. The protest movement largely came out condemning the economic crisis that had put so much burdens on ordinary citizens, but also blaming this economic crisis on, a corrupt government, years of mismanagement of government funds, things like electricity cuts, electricity rationing, the inability of government to provide basic services such as water, collecting of garbage. Military veterans had protested prior to the October 2019 protests, protesting the possibility of their pensions being taken away. The central bank then implemented capital controls, which then led to the currency losing a huge part of its value, almost over half of its value, 60% of its value against the dollar, which led to a huge financial crisis. So the protests also then prompted, more demands. The protest movement demanded an end to the government, demanded an end to corruption, also demanded an end to the sectarian-based electoral system, which Naeem will speak about more in terms of its history and how it came about to be in Lebanon. We saw Saad Hariri resigning, I think 2 weeks after the protest started. His resignation, unfortunately, did not end the protests. The protests continued. And in January this year, am I still on?
Okay, we lost you for a while, Machidisa, but
okay.
I think you're on now.
I'm back now. Okay. So since after the government of Hassan Diab came in, this government was, portrayed or painted as a very, non-partisan, technocratic, non-sectarian government. But the reality is that many of the so-called technocrats elected into this new government were very much still linked to the political elites, the political parties within Lebanon themselves, and hence their election did not stop the protests, did not meet the demands of the protesters. The protesters still called for an end to this government.
Sorry to interrupt. Just at this stage, let's sort of rest it there for a while, because we want to talk about the protests or the situation just before the blast, and we'll come back to that. Also at this stage, I want to inform viewers that the Facebook page, the Academia Library Facebook page is live, so you can also watch there. And of course, your questions can be directed to the panelists, generally, or in particular to a panelist via the YouTube and the Facebook page. But Sidiso, I'll come back to you because you've raised some interesting points which tie in with the history, really. And Naeem, I want to welcome you now, Naeem Gina, the Executive Director of AMAC. Now, Naeem, Lebanon has been in crisis mode for decades, with civil wars ravaging the country. Now, of course, we need to see this through the lens of the background to the whole history. And this takes us back to the role of the French, the sectarian political system that has been in place, and the role of civil society. Naeem, perhaps if you can give us just a background to the creation of Lebanon, how did Lebanon get onto the map, and the role of the French?
Thank you, Farid. Perhaps I should start by saying that, as with many colonial creations, Lebanon perhaps should not exist. Up to the early 20th century, up to 1920, when the Ottomans were defeated and that area was taken over, there wasn't a separate political entity called Lebanon. It was Sham. It was part of Syria. But once the French took over and were given the mandate for Lebanon, you found that they used, as colonialists did in various other parts of the world as well, they used existing differences among people in order to entrench their rule in certain ways, and in order to be able better to exploit the resources of those places. In the Lebanese context, what we found was that under the French rule, so the French took over in 1920. In 1926, there was the passage of something called the Constitution of Lebanon. And in a sense, what we are living with now, in terms of the politics of Lebanon, goes back to that era. The 1926 Constitution spoke about the different sects within Lebanon, and it is that constitution that said that the government should be 50% Muslim, 50% Christian. That was refined later. That the president of Lebanon should always be a Christian, in effect Maronite, although there are various different Christian denominations. That the prime minister should be a Sunni Muslim. Later in 1932, so this was a creation in a sense of the French in 1926. In 1932, the various sectarian leaders got together and they agreed in what is called a national pact that in future this kind of sectarian division, political division, will continue. The president will always be Christian, the prime minister always Sunni, and the Speaker of Parliament would always be Shia. And the parliament would be divided, parliamentary seats would be divided in terms of the sects, in terms of the demography at the time. So there was a census in 1932, which was the last census taken in Lebanon. And in terms of that, whether the census was accurate or not is also a debate, but assuming it was accurate, the Christian population was slightly more than 50%, and Muslims slightly less than 50%. And that has been the division within the Lebanese parliament since then. And it's not just Christian and Muslim, of course. There are subdivisions between them as well. So among Muslims, there's a certain proportion for Sunni Muslims, certain proportion for Shia Muslims, certain proportion for Druze. Among Christians, there's the Maronites, there's other Catholic groups, there's the Orthodox, etc., etc. And that became entrenched, and when the French left in 1946, this system continued. That whole sectarian balance is regarded as being very fragile, and you spoke about civil war earlier on. A Palestinian friend who lives in Beirut once said to me that Lebanon is always only 1 week away from civil war. No matter when it is, it's 1 week away from civil war. And we had a 15-year civil war from 1975 to 1990. To a large extent, it was based on it was a sectarian civil war, but essentially Muslim-Christian. But the interesting thing is that while the politics and the economics in Lebanon is based on different sects, sectional or sectarian alliances are quite fluid. And I think that perhaps one good example of this is that, that Lebanon was under Syrian occupation for almost 30 years in various forms, from 1976 to 2005. The Syrians didn't go into Lebanon, as many people seem to think, at the invitation of the Shia population. They went in at the invitation of the Maronite, the Christian Maronites, in order to defeat particularly the Amal group, which is Shia. And over time, the alliances changed. Currently, the Matsiriso mentioned that the dominant force within the Lebanese government and parliament is the Hezbollah alliance. Hezbollah itself, as a party, has a small number of people within the government and a small number of people within parliament. But the alliance that it has is with Amal, which is also a Shia party, with Michel Aoun's Free Patriotic Movement, which is a Christian party, etc. The same Michel Aoun in the 1980s and 1990s was one of the most vociferous people attacking the Syrians and calling for them to end the occupation. So these alliances are quite changing. In fact, Saad Hariri, who's Sunni and one of the great opponents of Hezbollah, at the time when he resigned last year in October 2019, he was in place as prime minister because the Hezbollah alliance chose him to be so, despite the fact that he's an opponent of Hezbollah. So the sectarian politics, Farid, has a lot to do with everything that happens in Lebanon, and the alliances as well. Now, the political elite that is often spoken about by Lebanese activists is an elite in some ways that comes out of the post-1990 period. 1990 was when the civil war ended, and politics was renewed, the creation of a new parliament, etc. But many of the people that are part of that elite date to before that. So Michel Aoun, who's now president, he's been active in Lebanese politics for decades. Saad Hariri's father, Rafiq Hariri, was elected prime minister or appointed prime minister, whatever, in 1992, immediately after the civil war. He was a businessman even through the civil war period. The Jamail family, all of these families that had been involved in politics, but many of them also had been involved in the civil war. And that's why many Lebanese activists today speak about the political elite as being made up of warlords. These are people who, with their families, had been very much involved in the civil war, the 15-year civil war that ended in 1990, and thereafter got into politics again. Perhaps the only kind of big political party that doesn't have that pedigree, of decades-old pedigree going back into the civil war and sectarian politics before, is Hezbollah. Because Hezbollah is a later creation in a sense than many of these, although it also in a sense was created to protect, partly to protect the Shia population, which was coming under attack, and then later its bigger kind of agenda became the resistance against Israel.
So Naeem, if I can just, sorry to interrupt you, because the Hezbollah was, of course, very strong in the south. I mean, that's where I think the grassroots support lies. How was the transition from that kind of grassroots support and, of course, the aura that kind of surrounded Hezbollah being the only Arab army, as it's often said, to have defeated the Zionist army? How did that transition into Hezbollah playing such a significant role in Lebanese politics, Naeem?
So Hezbollah started as this group that was meant to, as I say, protect the Shia population in some kind of way. So Amal had existed already, and Hezbollah came about thereafter. Its support has been and remains very strong in the south of Lebanon. The south of Lebanon is largely Shia and Christian. And when we talk about Hezbollah support in the south, it is Shia and Christian. I mean, it's not atypical to walk into a Christian house, a Christian home in Lebanon South, and see pictures of Jesus, Mary, and Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hamas. I mean, of Hezbollah, sorry. And part of the reason is that the people in the south regard Hezbollah as being the one that liberated them from Israeli occupation. Remember that Israel occupied a good part of the south, partly by itself and partly in alliance with the Southern Lebanese Army, which was a Christian group. And they were forced out from most of those southern areas, except Sheba Farms, by Hezbollah. So the people in the south, including Christians, regard Hezbollah as liberators. But at some point, Hezbollah made the decision that it needed to be involved in a more direct way in the political setup in Lebanon. And the main reason for this is because by this stage, apart from the fact that at that time, which is now changed, at that time its constitution and charter spoke about Lebanon as, creating Lebanon as an Islamic state, etc. But its main agenda was resistance against Israel. And increasingly, as Hezbollah gained strength and became even more powerful than the Lebanese army, increasingly there was the threat that the Lebanese government would, partly because of the sectarian politics and partly because of pressure from foreign powers, would clamp down on Hezbollah, particularly in terms of its weapons, and confiscate its weapons. This has been a call from the United States, from various European governments, etc. And so Hezbollah got involved in Lebanese politics in order to protect its resistance framework and its resistance project. And so until very recently, it has been very careful to ensure that it didn't have any kind of dominance in terms of the government or in parliament. So in the government, when it was allocated its seats, because it was part of that sectarian setup, it would not take up all the seats, or it would take up ministerial positions that were not very significant. So it wouldn't take up foreign affairs, it wouldn't take up those kinds of portfolios, because its only reason for being in government was in order to protect its resistance project. More recently, that has changed, partly because it got involved in the political game, if you like, and that has resulted now in the kind of position where many of the protests or many of the protesters and organizations, civil society organizations, part of the protests, are directing their venom at the political elite, and within that they include Hezbollah. And then there is, of course, within among those protesters as well, those who are genuinely and have always been anti-Hezbollah. But it also includes people who have a bit of a dilemma, because at one level they support Hezbollah's political project, but at another level regard Hezbollah as part of a political elite, a sectarian political elite that must lose that power.
Naeem, we'll rest the discussion there for now. You have some interesting points that have come up, of course, which I would like to explore. And just to our listeners or viewers as well, you can post your questions to the Academia Library Facebook page and on the Academia YouTube channel. And we will have our panelists engaging with you. But now we are ready to be joined by Imran Chunara. He is the CEO of the Africa Muslims Agency, and he is in Beirut at the moment. Assalamu alaikum, Imran, and thanks for joining us.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Fareed, and of course Naeem and Wachidiso as well, and Hussein, and of course to all the viewers and listeners today. Great being with you guys.
So you're there right on the ground, the Imran, and there are a couple of things that I want to, and I'm sure our viewers are interested in really knowing the aftermath of the explosion. Just generally, how are the families, how are the people coping? What is the situation on the ground at the moment?
Well, first of all, Fareed, I think it's great the way Matshidiso and of course Naeem has put a framework to the history of the political space of Lebanon, and it is obviously very complex. It is not very simple. It started very complex back in the early 1900s, and of course it continues to this day. Now, talking about the explosion cannot be spoken about in isolation, because the explosion was just 10, 11 days ago. And most of the world has been watching Lebanon and Beirut for the past 10, 11 days. And to be frank, most of the world thinks that Beirut and Lebanon and Lebanese people have only had these challenges for that matter over the last 10, 11 days. But it precedes that and predates that, as Naeem and Matshidiso so clearly mentioned. But I want to tell you that on the ground, because as a humanitarian organization, our focus is primarily on the human impact. Because, of course, the political discussion is seriously important. Without that political will and political move to make a change, and without the international community getting involved on that level to make a change on the fundamental level, things will never change in Lebanon if that's not moved forward. However, who suffers? Because we have all this terminology around it, and for me, I like to just cut through that and say, wait a second, what happens? Who suffers? The human being suffers. Generations suffer. You see, we always talk about this kind of rhetoric about, the future will be bright for our children. The future is going to be amazing for the next generation. What next generation are we talking about? We destroy them as children and we expect the future to be better for them as the next generation. Today you're talking about the impact on the ground today, for example. Today I arrived this morning in Beirut. Now, AMA, African Muslim Agency, we're grateful to have been working in Lebanon for the past number of years. So I've been here many, many times. And I came here last night. I was flying here with mixed emotions because I arrived here this morning. And yes, I can see, we talk about how quantifiable it is, the destruction, the physical destruction, the infrastructure, so many billions of dollars of infrastructure and physical destruction of the buildings for kilometers in Beirut that has been destroyed. And, this is what it will cost to rebuild Beirut. Nonsense. That's not what it will cost to rebuild Beirut. That will cost to rebuild Beirut physically, practically. But that's not Beirut. That's not Lebanon. Lebanon is its people, the youth, the youngsters, the children. That's the future of Lebanon, not the buildings. Yeah, the buildings, we can put billions of dollars. I'm not trying to minimize that in the infrastructure. Don't get me wrong. But when you go into people's homes and you know that they were starving prior to the explosion, the economic crisis, as Matshidiso covered, and of course the capital controls and those kind of things, 60%, 61% of youth unemployed. And we talk about all of this and that political history. If something doesn't get changed on that side, then we can have this discussion forever. But who's suffering? The future of Lebanon does not get changed just because you put new buildings. So yes, there's billions of dollars impact, of course. But when you go to somebody's house and you witness and you speak to a father who came home from buying bread and he saw his 22-year-old daughter hanging from the balcony dead, how does he forget that? 17-year-old girl was in ICU for the past, 10 days, 9 days, whatever the case is. And when she woke up today, the doctors didn't want to tell her that her mother and her sister died. And she told them, I remember that they died because I tried to resuscitate them. So before she was taken away and fell into a coma, she tried to resuscitate her mother, who was under the rubble. At 17 years old, how do you forget that image in your mind? What's the emotional, psychological, and mental trauma that this youth and children will experience for decades? So when we talk about impact, I want to focus on human impact more than anything else, because that's the future. And that's why we are here on the ground as humanitarians.
So Imran, that brings me to this point about the kind of psychological scars. Lebanon has been a country which has been home to thousands of refugees from different parts, of course, particularly the Palestinians, and then in later years, or in recent years rather, Syrians as well. But the psychological scars, can you just talk to us about that? Because I know the work that the African Muslim Agency has been doing in the various refugee camps was related to, much of it was related to the psychological impact that these disasters and, the disaster that is Lebanon has had on the people. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
First of all, and very good question. And, remember that the refugees here are not thousands, but millions. Millions of refugees. And we work in many of the refugee camps, the Palestinian and the Syrian refugee camps. And remember, the Palestinians have been here for how long? Since the 40s? They've been here. This is now second, third generation being born, living here as refugees with no real country. So yes, the psychological impact is huge. Now, we have a program called Basamat, which literally means smile. That's in the refugee camps, of course, because we understand that these young kids, if you don't deal with their psychological trauma of what they've witnessed in Syria and Palestine, what they've seen, when they've seen their own. We talk about a young boy, Amin, who came home from school in Syria, and his home was completely collapsed, and his mother and father had been killed. So when these young children witness that, you and I in South Africa, when you think about it at the moment, I've got 3 kids. They've never seen something like that, ever close, actually. They don't even watch TV with violence on it, let alone anything like that. These kids, can you imagine? So we talk about, where does resentment come from? Where does hatred, anger, bitterness for the future? It comes because we as adults currently are destroying those children's future. Because if you witness that happen to you, to your parents, to your mom, to your dad, to your grandfather, your grandmother, what does it do to the inside of you? So it's easy. We can give food, yes. We can give water, yes. We give medical supplies, yes. We give clothing, yes. Of course, that's necessary for the human survival. But that's not where it should stop, because of the psychological trauma. Today, I was in somebody's home, for example, just thinking about finding little dolls of kids, and people are trying to find memories. People are going into the rubble trying to find memories. And here's the thing, folks. Most youth don't care about the sectarianism. They don't care about this. When you speak to young people on the ground, I've spoken to, here's an interesting thing. Last year I was here and we worked with a youth group in Tripoli. And I think she's a Christian woman, Christian woman, right? She's a Christian woman, and she brought together 2 fighting youth groups. These guys have been fighting for decades. Their parents have been fighting. Half of them don't know why they're fighting, but because their grandfather said that side, we oppose that side, and we will destroy them forever. She brought these warring parties together to start rebuilding Tripoli. And she said, you know what? And when you speak to these young people, and we spend days with the youth, and you see Shia, Muslim, Maronite Christian, Druze, you see all these people, and you say, the young people, they actually speak very resentfully towards this sectarianism, because they say, because they realize their future's at stake. Because of this century-old mentality of, we are superior to you, you are superior to us, I'm inferior, you superior, so let's split everything based on religion and cultural lines or tribal lines, and as if that, come on. The same creator that created your child created my child. The same creator that created a child with a darker color skin created a child with a lighter color skin. So who gives the right to decide one is superior to another? That's complete nonsense. And the youth and the children suffer. And my biggest thing is psychological trauma. So Basamat Center was created for that in the refugee camps. And now we're working in Beirut. It's going to be very different. Beirut, the psychological assistance that are required and the therapy required is going to be for a very long time. Come on, folks. If we want to fix and help, and by the way, we cannot come here as outsiders and attempt to fix Lebanon. Like South Africa, we're a strong nation. We did not need the world to fix us. We needed the world to support us and help us to strengthen ourselves so we could stand up and grow and develop a future for ourselves. Lebanon does not need us to come and tell it what to do and fix it. It needs us to support the youth. Support, because they are the future. Help them. Strengthen them. They're on their knees right now so that they can grow And when they grow, they will stand up because they're a proud nation. The same as South Africans are.
Imran, on that point, AMA has been doing a lot of work on the ground, and of course, the support is needed for the work that AMA is doing. And just at the end of this this clip, or this discussion rather, we will put up the certain details how you can support AMA. But what are the most urgent needs right now? And I know we're talking long term, and I accept that, but there are also urgent needs. How can South Africans, for example, help? And we are one humanity. We are affected by whatever happens in other parts of the world. So how can people help? What are the urgent humanitarian needs?
I think good point, Farid, because otherwise it gets, sometimes we can be there's so many aspects. Let's narrow it down to what's the immediate urgent need. So first of all, of course, food. Now, food almost becomes some of the rolls of our tongue. There's so many NGOs doing amazing work, by the way. AMA is not the only one. And that's why I always want to remind viewers and listeners, doesn't matter what interview I do ever, is that there's no such thing as the biggest, the only, the main, the first, the best in any field for that matter. We don't compete with each other. We complete each other. So there are many NGOs doing incredible work here in Lebanon and around the world, of course, in many, many sectors. So when we talk about food, often it becomes so blasé, food. But food, I mean, if you lost everything tomorrow, you got no appliances at home, you got nothing, your whole home is destroyed, your family still needs to eat. They still need to eat. You and I go out, the biggest worry we have in South Africa right now is if I go to the shop, will I get coronavirus? And I better make sure that I stay away and get my week supply or month supply or whatever the case is. Yes, there are poverty-stricken areas in South Africa too, don't get me wrong. But here right now, they have zero. Everything's collapsed. And now they need to eat tomorrow morning. So food is a massive thing. Clean drinking water, it's a massive thing. But then medical help. This week, I'll be going to support 3 hospitals, as AMA through our donors, supporting 3 hospitals with medical equipment and medical supplies. That's a massive need. Upwards of 6,000 people still in hospital. That's besides the coronavirus issue. That becomes secondary for them.
Sure.
So
Imran, I'm going to come back.
Is a massive thing.
Okay. I'm going to come back to you because I see our viewers are responding. They're posting questions. Let's go for the first question. And Naeem and Matsidisho, I'm going to sort of throw it to both of you, and you can just sort of decide who will go first. It's from Zaytun Abed on YouTube, and her question is: Gordon Duff, a senior editor of Veterans Today in America, received intel from some weapons experts stating that the blast was caused by an Israeli nuclear missile. How true is this? But Sidisha, do you want to tackle that one?
Okay, I'll say a bit, and then Naeem can also then say a little bit about that. So when the blast happened, if you went on social media, on Twitter, there were different accounts, people saying they saw an Israeli F-16 pass through before the blast went through. Immediately, Israel denied any involvement. The government of Lebanon itself say their preliminary investigation revealed that it was caused by what has been described as 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate material that was improperly stored at the port. And the explosion of this ammonium nitrate is the reason this blast then happened and caused such huge damage. We've seen in recent days Hassan Nasrallah suggesting that they're making their own investigations, and if there is an Israeli link, they will respond to this. As I said, what we've seen is the official account of what the government's saying and what government investigations are revealing at this point. I don't know, Naeem, you want to add?
Naeem, would you say that the government, the official response that came immediately, is the one that's the one that media has accepted? But do you think that could be more to it, and particularly looking at Zaytun Abed's question?
Look, it's not just the Lebanese government. No important Lebanese organization, party, ministry is saying that it was the Israelis. At this stage, perhaps at this stage, there isn't enough evidence. And so I'm very wary and very, frankly, suspicious of Western experts, particularly people who have a bit of a tendency to kind of lay the blame for everything on the Americans and the Israelis, and a bit of a tendency for dabbling in conspiracies. I'm very wary of accepting those accounts rather than the accounts of Lebanese groups. I mean, if Hezbollah says that at the moment it seems like it was an accident, our investigation might show something else, but at the moment it seems like it was an accident. Well, I would say not accident, but negligence. Then why should we then accept something from such experts? The other point about this is the fact that Israel denied involvement so quickly after, and before it was even accused of it, in itself should raise a bit of a red flag. Now, the red flag doesn't mean that they were responsible for it. The red flag could mean other things. For example, one of the people who's been touting this theory that Israel was behind the attack is a journalist who's been quoted, I'm not going to mention his name, who's been quoted a lot for this theory. And he said that his source is an Israeli intelligence official. Now, Israel is very good and has been for decades very good at its propaganda. So think about this. An Israeli official releases this great information to, frankly, a bit of an obscure journalist, not a mainstream journalist, that says that Israel was behind this attack. And the reason why Israel was behind this attack is because Hezbollah had an arms cache at the port. What's the point here? Everyone is going to debunk the fact that Israel was involved because let's assume there was no involvement. There's going to be no evidence to prove that Israel was involved. But what's the final takeaway from that? The final takeaway is that Hezbollah had an arms cache in the port. And so accusing Israel is actually one way of demonizing its enemy, which is Hezbollah. I think we should be really very careful about these kinds of theories. Until there's a proper investigation that says anything different, everything at the moment points to negligence and an accident that fed into that negligence to create this disaster.
Yeah, I think you make an important point there, Naeem, because I don't think Israel, even when they bomb a hospital, they justify it, So, if they were really responsible, and as you say, as Hezbollah says, evidence may come later. But I think it's a significant point, and looking at what the agenda would be to sort of plant that information that Israel was actually behind this blast. If I'm going to stay with you, Naeem, and just pick up on something that Imran spoke about, and the sectarianism, because that seems to be the kind of factor that creates the kind of not melting pot, but boiling pot in Iran, but in Lebanon, I beg your pardon. But can I just take a step back, because there's a question that has just come in, and it's from Khalid Safuddin. Khalid asks, why would the Lebanese government step down in the midst of such a catastrophe? Surely something is being hidden from the Lebanese people. So yeah, I get the sense that Khalid is saying that the Lebanese government has something to cover up. Naeem, would you just want to touch on that, and maybe then we can pass it on to Machidisa?
So I assume that Khalid is talking about the Hassan Diab government that resigned a few days after, right?
Yeah.
Look, they resigned in order to save their own skins, because by resigning, they are able to place the blame on others, which is what Hassan Diab did. I don't think that it's a justifiable finger pointing from his perspective, but that's what he did. In his resignation speech and letter to Aoun, he decried the kind of criminal negligence around the port. He decried corruption in the government, and he blamed everything on the political elites. Who is Hassan Diab? I mean, he's an academic, sure. He taught at the American University of Beirut before this, but he's part of that same elite, the same political elite. His ministers, the so-called technocratic government, they all, as with Lebanese politicians in general, are recycled. But with this disaster taking place, them resigning is them being able to say, this disaster happened because of the people who came before us. Now, this recycling, if I can just end on this point, Farid, this recycling of Lebanese politicians is part of the reason why young people in particular are protesting on the streets, even through the COVID-19 pandemic. It's because Michel Aoun, who was this big general in the 1980s, is now the president. Saad Hariri is the son of Rafiq Hariri. He left, he resigned, after the protests in October were against his government. He resigned in December, and we had a new government in January. He's being touted as one of the possible new prime ministers to be appointed. It's just a whole recycling. So this is why protesters are calling for this whole thing to be overhauled, because this is what you get. One prime minister resigns and blames the guy that came before him, and then the guy before him becomes the prime minister again and will blame the guy before him.
I do have a question which is regarding the humanitarian response, but I'll come to that, and maybe Imran and Hussein, you can just be on standby for that. But Matshidiso, the question of sectarianism, how it is, Naeem traced the history going back almost 100 years when this was put in place. Is it a major factor? Because we heard from Imran that the youth are saying, look, we're sick and tired of this. Do you think it could actually change the political face of Lebanon? There could be a rethink about the constitution. Do you think that is possible in the short term?
I think there could be major changes, as you said. Maybe a new constitution could be redrafted. We might maybe see some sort of a unity government. There's talks of some sort of a unity government, some representatives from the protesters, civil society, new political parties, etc. But as Naeem has said, this sectarian electoral system or way of governance in Lebanon is so entrenched, even as part of the society's fabric. It's very much entrenched. I don't think in the short term we will see quite a big change in terms of how people will even go about voting. I mean, we might have a ballot paper if they call elections in 2021, for example, a ballot paper that has candidates, not linked to any sects, but people might still vote according to the way they feel that their sectarian needs or sectarian lines lie into. These sectarian leaders who've been there, as Naima said, from way before, have used these sectarian lines to form their own patrimonial corrupt lineages within the constituencies in which they govern. They have major shares in many of the big banks in Lebanon that have loaned the state loans at exorbitant interest rates. They own quite a lot of shares in different companies and firms that operate in Lebanon's largely construction sector, which lots of revenue does not end up with the government because the government is unable to tax it and ends up in the pockets of many of these political elites. They have interests and money stored away in offshore accounts, and this is why the US sanctions have been a little bit more effective in terms of limiting some of these transactions with many of these political elites. I'm not saying the US is some sort of a savior, but I'm just highlighting that the kind of corruption and patrimonial links that have existed made possible by the sectarian division. And as Naeem said, this so-called recycling of leaders is in effect the re-engineering and reformulation of the same system. And I think if protesters were to get their way, it would, take quite a long time. It is a long-term vision to be able to get to a point where we see Lebanon, outside of this sectarian framework.
In fact, the protests are something that we need to focus on. But, just a reminder also, this is the Al-Ikhlas Academia Library webinar. You can tune in via the YouTube channel, the Al-Ikhlas YouTube channel, as well as Facebook. And that's how you can get your questions through to us. And we also have other media partners, the VOC. We are live on VOC 91.3 FM, CII Radio, Salam Media, as well as ITV. Now, Imran or Hussein, maybe I should ask Hussein, and then Imran can take it up from that. The question is, how has the humanitarian response been impacted by COVID-19? So this could, I would like you to touch on sort of pre-explosion and post-explosion, but the particular impact of COVID-19. Hussein, if I can ask you to take it up first.
I think the situation in Beirut, Brother Farid, with COVID-19, hospitals were already at overcapacity. And with the blast, that is pre 4th of August. Of course, on the 4th of August, some hospitals were damaged, and that just compounded the situation in the healthcare system. So, of course, through the humanitarian teams on the ground, we were able to facilitate, like I mentioned earlier, medical clinics to assist the wounded on the ground. But I think Imran, being on the ground right now in Beirut and also being there previously, just a few months back, can share more light in terms of what the medical infrastructure is right now in Beirut.
But I think, Farid, when you talk about the explosion and the coronavirus and COVID-19, how does it affect the humanitarian response? First of all, in the refugee camps, can you imagine that if coronavirus broke out in any one camp, what would happen? It would be an absolute nightmare because there's no healthcare system set up in the refugee camps per se. And, we can talk a lot about some of the politics that happened last year in Lebanon that were actually destroyed a lot of the structures in the camps, etc. That's a discussion for another time. But it just actually, whatever little infrastructure did exist was destroyed. So pre-explosion time, thankfully, the refugee camps are so contained. In a weird kind of way, it was a positive because it's so contained that and so closed that for a large percentage of refugee camps, coronavirus did not break out. However, of course, our teams, you have to take the precautions. So we had obviously all the PPE, all that kind of stuff all the time, 24/7. But you remember the refugee camps, those people were dependent on humanitarian aid. They did not have jobs. They were not social distancing. They don't have any job, they don't have any income. They were dependent on food already. They don't live if they don't get humanitarian support. So when coronavirus hit the world, of course, and lockdown hit the world, they could not do that. They still needed humanitarians. So NGOs still had to go in. Thankfully, our partners on the ground have those kind of permits to be able to go into the refugee camps. Otherwise, they have mass starvation going on in some of the camps that we operate in. But the explosion, of course, just made it so much worse. But I can tell you right now, being on the ground, is that there are many NGOs from around the world here right now making a massive impact. And I say that because pretty much all of the relief that's happening, and I would hazard a guess at almost 100%, is coming from the NGO sector. It's not coming from government agencies, not at all. So, as much as these political elite exist and these sects exist, let me tell you, when you get to the ground, today I was in an area called Quarantina, for example. This Muslims and Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Christians all live side by side as neighbors. We were offering this one guy some help in his home to buy appliances and furniture. And he was saying, yes, but I've got 3 other neighbors in this building and I want for them as well, please. When we go and help people clean up their rubble and start sweeping their streets and that kind of thing, the Muslims, Christians, Shia, Sunni, whatever, comes together and does it together. Today there was a church where I was, where Muslims and Christians together in the church honoring the souls of the martyrs, praying. Whether the Muslims were praying and the Christians were praying in their own way, but they were all in the church praying and just honoring the souls of the martyrs as they would, the people who passed on in this explosion, and coming together. So when you work with the young people and the general population on the ground, there are genuinely 4 million Lebanese with so many different sects and groups. But I tell you, when this elite fights on this sectarial lines, the majority of the people just want to live their lives, and they want to live together. They don't want to kill each other and hurt each other and destroy each other. They don't prefer to do that, especially the youth.
Okay, so let us, Naeem, if I can ask you, pick up on that point, and we were talking about sectarianism, and it seems to be kind of a dominating the discussion because it is a major factor. What we've heard from Imran, the people saying, we're tired of it, and they're showing it in tangible ways, going into the churches, praying together for, irrespective of whether it's Christian or Muslim. Do you think this force on the ground can pose a challenge to the political elites in whose favor perhaps maybe sectarianism plays in their hands?
See, Farid, it's two things. It's the people that make up the political elite, but it's also the political system. It's that system that gives rise to the kind of clientelism that Matsidiso spoke about, cronyism that she mentioned. People are kept in power by the system. That system that began in 1926 with that constitution then, through 1932 and thereafter, that system ensures that power can only be distributed on the basis of sect. And so ordinary people might feel that they live together, they're neighbors and all of that. But when it comes time to vote in an election, they don't have a choice. They're bound by a particular system. And so what needs to change is not just that the political elite needs to be gotten rid of, overthrown, whatever you want to call it, but the entire political system needs to be overhauled. The electoral system needs to be overhauled in a way that you have a new form of democracy that doesn't allow sectarian clientelism to reproduce itself. That's the issue. So, it's not necessarily saying that this person who's a parliamentarian is a bad person. That might be true. But that's not the point. The point is that the system is there and it does what it does, and all of those that are benefiting from that system want to continue to protect that system, all of them. And that is that political elite. Whether they're warlords, whether they're academics, whatever they are, that system is being protected. Now you said we need to come to talk about the protests a little more. The one problem with the protests is that the protests are not the protests are not aiming for a revolution. They're not aiming to overthrow the entire system. They're calling for it to be changed. They're calling for reforms to happen. And the problem with that is that the reforms can only happen by the people who are the beneficiaries of the system, and they have no interest in changing it.
Talking of political solutions and elites, we also have the foreign powers, and then it takes us back to France almost 100 years ago, 1926, but they're back again. And so there's a question from Fatima Harun Masood, and Fatima asks, she says, there is a call for France to take control. Exactly from where that came from, maybe Matshidiso, you can enlighten us on that. But the follow-up question is, can France be a solution? Well, they created the problem, but the question is, can France be a solution? Matshidiso, can I ask you to take that one?
I think, there's a famous saying by many government officials in Africa that say, indigenous solutions for indigenous problems. But as you said, this was a problem created by France, but I don't think France should get involved. We already saw the grandstanding that was done by Emmanuel Macron when he visited Beirut 2 days after the blast. There was huge crowds following him, many people saying, France must do something, get rid of these people, etc. But that will only create more problems. We've already seen, France's many utterances against the government. Since his visit to Beirut, we've seen an increase of very harsh anti-government protesters, signaling out, few people. Especially we've seen anti-Nasrallah protests since this thing. We've also seen he's invited the, people who we know are inherently against the well-being of the Lebanese people. He invited Israel to that donor conference, that donor virtual conference that he held a few days after his visit to Beirut. Immediately after that, the Wall Street Journal reports that the US is preparing sanctions against Hezbollah and its allies in Lebanon to try and squeeze their increasing political dominance in Lebanon. As Naeem has said, it's the people that demanded this change. It's not France. France is literally piggybacking on the demands of the protesters that have been there since then. As people who lived under colonialism, who continue to live under neo-imperialism, and the Lebanese are those people. They need to bring in their own change, the change that they want to see, because any foreign interference to come and try and remove this government, that government's only going to be replaced by a government that only represent the interests of those countries. And we know France does not really care about the well-being of the Lebanese people. Otherwise, they wouldn't have colonized them in the first place. So this thing of looking for foreign powers as some sort of a savior for people in the region is completely wrong, and it's a very negative sentiment. It also suggests that Lebanese people themselves can't take control of their own lives.
Naeem, you mentioned earlier about people asking for reform to the political system, and there is not revolution. Although there was an analyst on Al Jazeera, I think it was Ramzi Khouri, who spoke about revolution, and he said there is a group which is saying that we need a revolution. But do you think it will eventually come to that? We have had the experience of the Arab Spring and how it has turned out in certain places. And I just want to mention the Tripoli that was mentioned earlier, because I think some viewers just a bit thrown off guard. There's a Tripoli in Lebanon as well. So we're talking about Tripoli in Lebanon and not the Libyan one. But Naeem, just coming back to the question of call for a revolution. Do you think there is a possibility, given how Arab Spring sort of panned out?
Look, I don't think that's going to happen. And why I say I don't think it's going to happen is because Lebanon is really for decades, Lebanon has not been under the full control of Lebanese people. It's a playground for various foreign powers. France treats Lebanon the way France treats Francophone African countries. They think that they still are the colonial power. But you also have the US and its influence there. You have Saudi Arabia, you have Iran, and Lebanese politics and all of that is determined to a large extent by these foreign powers. None of them is going to allow a kind of full-scale revolution. France, that is, and let me just say to Fatima, who asked that question, those people on the street that were asking Macron for France to take over Lebanon, these things are always staged. You're not going to have a French prime minister coming into a third world country and his security detail not knowing who are the people who are going to be around him. These things are staged. So when these things happen, I mean, France would be very accepting, for example, if Saad Hariri became the next prime minister, and he could be instructed on what to do. Remember, this is the Saad Hariri who is a client of Saudi Arabia and France at the same time. He went to Saudi Arabia, what was it, 2 years ago, Matsidi? So went to Saudi Arabia and was forced to announce his resignation. Came back to Lebanon as a resigned prime minister, then went to France and suddenly retracted his resignation. this is the Saad Hariri that was protested against in October last year, against whose government the protest started. If he becomes prime minister now, and he could, France will be quite happy. Yet he is part of that same corrupt political elite. So, they're not going to allow that kind of a revolution. What I think, what is required is that the movements of the protesters, and the protest movement is very diverse, and among them are supporters of the different political parties, but the protesters, organizations within and parties within the protest movement need to find some way in which they can negotiate with at least sections of the political elite, particularly with Hezbollah. At the moment, or since October, there's no real negotiations taking place between the two. There's protests on the street, there's demands made on the street, and the government then decides which demands it would respond to and how. But if you have a forum where you have this kind of situation where protest leaders, representatives sit together with those from among the political elite that are amenable to the demand that the system needs to change, and I think that Hezbollah, at least sections of Hezbollah, would be, then you could see real changes taking place without a revolution, because I think a revolution would be put down very early if it were to start.
Just a quick one to you again, Naeem. In terms of Hezbollah and particularly Hassan Nasrallah, I think yesterday on the streets there were calls, branding him a terrorist, etc. Again, genuine feelings on the ground, or and I know you pointed it out, and then this we have seen by the visits to Africa as well, the crowd, rent a crowd type of thing. But the popularity of Hassan Nasrallah, where does it stand at the moment?
No, that is a genuine feeling on the ground. The politics in Lebanon is very polarized, and there are those who hate Nasrallah. Certainly within the Sunni population, not all, but within the Sunni population, within the Christian population, but even within the Shia population, those that are old, diehard Amal types, don't particularly like Hezbollah or Hassan Nasrallah. So is that a genuine sentiment? Yes, it's a genuine sentiment. I'm not saying how big a sentiment it is, whether it's a minority, majority, whatever the case is, it is a sentiment. But also in more general terms, look, immediately after the 2006 Israeli war on Lebanon, there were polls that were conducted in the Arab world, and Hassan Nasrallah came out as the most popular Arab leader. That has changed substantially since 2011, since Hezbollah got involved in Syria. These days in the Arab world, unfortunately, I would say, but this is the reality of politics. That unfortunately in the Arab world, for many Arabs, particularly most Sunni Arabs, and Sunnis make up the majority of the Arab world, of the Arab population, Sayyid Hassan is seen as a Shia sectarian leader for many of them, not as this most popular Arab leader. Can Hezbollah change that image? Can Hassan Nasrallah change that image? That is left to be seen. But at the moment, they're not in the same position in terms of their image, whether within Lebanon or more broadly, as they were by 2010.
Okay, but Shadiso, I'm going to come to you now, and it's also part of your wrapping up, looking at rebuilding Lebanon. We've heard from Naeem, we've heard from you as well about the kind of factors that impact. But what is the road ahead? Just in terms of how is the situation unfolding, given what this position is on the ground. One is, I think maybe I could say your wish list, but also what is, given the reality of what's happening right now, how do you see events unfolding, say, in the next couple of weeks?
I think what we're going to see, or what's supposed to happen, is twofold: on the political front and on the economic front. So since France has, been the so-called leader of raising funds for Lebanon since the blast, the so-called fundraising is also twofold. It's very short-term, which is like mostly directed at providing immediate short-term humanitarian relief. And it's also long-term, where international financing institutions such as the IMF and World Bank, which this Hassan Diab government has been in negotiation with and engaging with, to get some sort of a financial rescue package, are involved. They have been calling for conditions for reform from the Lebanese government before any aid or financial packages can be released to them. So this government, I suppose, will try and as the Hassan Diab government has stayed in as a so-called caretaker government, that's its main priorities. Try to get some money to make, or that should be its priorities, to make some real changes, try do some rebuilding. I mean, 300,000 people displaced because of the blast. There's quite a lot of rebuilding and reconstruction that needs to go in. On the political front, the protesters are getting more intense. They're getting more confrontational with the security forces. There needs to be more engagement from the government with the protesters. Up to so far, we have not seen any, real engagement whatsoever. At the start of the protest, there was Hezbollah and Amal supporters who confronted these protesters, and government simply dismissing these protesters as driving a foreign agenda. I think this needs to change. A big part of the problem now is that the government is completely removed from what's happening or what the needs of the people on the ground. I mean, there's reports that government isn't even going to the streets. You don't even see the politicians going to help people clean up the street, remove the rubble, etc. So there needs to be that long-term engagement. And in terms of these reforms that are placed on them by the likes of the IMF and the World Bank, I think with increasing pressure from international actors such as France and the US, the next government that's going to come in will sort of be forced to try and make some sort of, at least short-term changes. But we're likely to see an announcement of elections, new elections perhaps in 2021, and some talks of engaging some of the demands to change a little bit of the electoral system or change the electoral system altogether. I think there will be modifications. I doubt, between now and next year, if new elections are called, we will see an overall big change in terms of the political system that has governed Lebanon for so many years.
Naeem, I want a sort of just a broad look from your side, because and I'm looking at it from an AMAC, or I want you to look at it from an AMAC perspective. The impact it has on the rest of the region, the Zionists. We have had UAE and Israel normalizing relations. We've got an election coming up in November. The protests, can they be sustained? And how does all of this play into the very complex Middle East situation?
I think the protests can be sustained. Look, I think at the moment, nothing in Lebanon is sustainable, as Hussein and Imran will probably agree. So as sustainable as anything else is, the protests will be as well. They've been protesting continually from October last year. Numbers went down during the height of the pandemic, but the protests have been ongoing since October last year. The anger on the streets after the explosion have been tremendous. And particularly, as Matshidiso said, not just the government, but the state was absent on the streets in providing for people, in assisting people, etc. It was people doing it for themselves and assisting each other. So the anger is there, the protest will continue. How does it play out in the rest of the region? I think for one thing, that there's a whole range of things happening in the region right now, and Lebanon is not the highest priority in that list. But having said that, as I said, Lebanon is a kind of playground for others. And in recent years, particularly in terms of the regional context, not the global context, in terms of the regional context, particularly Saudi Arabia and Iran. Syria is very busy with its own issues and is not going to get involved right now in the Lebanese context. But remember that about 20% of the Lebanese population at the moment is Syrian refugees. That's a huge thing. If things start going or getting worse in Lebanon, as they possibly could, you can find a very strong, which is already there, a very strong kind of xenophobic feeling, forcing the government to send Syrian refugees back. This process has already started, but this could have a severe impact on Syria, and particularly on those refugees. Both Iran and Saudi Arabia, in the past few months at least, have, it seems, taken a position where they don't want to engage each other in Lebanon. And that's a good thing, I think. Both of them are really bogged down with their own other issues. Iran is very bogged down in Syria as well as in Iraq. Saudi Arabia is busy with its Khashoggi and other kind of stories, court case in the US, etc. And so Lebanon is not at the moment featuring very high up. If that remains the case, there's a better possibility that Lebanese might be allowed to chart their own way forward. And that, I think, would be a good thing.
Thank you, Naeem. And now for the final word in terms of the humanitarian efforts that are taking place, I'll first turn to Hussein, and then a final word from Imran. Hussein, plans and your call to the people?
Well, right now, as we're discussing, I think the question mark is not Lebanon. We're discussing Lebanon. The question mark is the person watching this right now, listening to this live stream right now. The question mark is based on them, because this is now brought to our attention, and there must be a reason why this is brought to our attention. Allah doesn't need you and I to change the situation out there in Lebanon. So because it brought to your attention, now it's, what are you going to do about it? Outside of politics, outside of all the sectarianism, people are in urgent need. You have the means, whatever it is, you can make a difference. I would encourage you listening or watching right now. Food is emergency right now. Water is an urgent need, and medical supplies. The teams are on the ground. I would encourage you to go to the website African Muslims Agency.co.za and play your part in making a difference to the people of Lebanon. And I also want to thank, before you go to Hafiz Imran, in closing, Brother Farid, I want to thank Dr. Parker and, of course, the Academia Library for giving us this platform as a pioneering platform. Dr. Parker, a well-known man, always coming up with ideas and initiatives in bringing people together and creating discussion points. So we're just honored to support and be a partner of Dr. Parker in the library. So I would encourage you listening right now, go to African Muslims Agency.co.za. Go on the website. Imran, our CEO, is on the ground. He can close up from a humanitarian point of view from African Muslims Agency.
Thanks. Imran in Beirut, are you still with us?
Yes, I am, Farid. And just, I think, closing comments, I think tonight's discussion was really, really important, really impactful, really necessary. And I think, from the political landscape and the humanitarian perspective, I think it brought a great balance. But again, from my side, I think, just in closing comments, I want to remind us that humanity is really one nation, because this is a song I will sing till my death. Is that the same person, the same being that created, the same creator that created. Whether if you find, and I say this often, if you find you're in a position where you can help someone, and you choose not to help them because of a difference in sect or religion or race or culture, nationality, ethnicity, there's something fundamentally wrong with your humanity. It's like me. I've got 3 kids. All 3 of them are different. And imagine if the one tells the other one, "I'm superior to you." I mean, I'll look at that one, I'll say, man, you idiot. No, you're not superior to that one, because all three are my kids. Now imagine our creator looking down on us, looking at, I created you, I created you, I created you. Doesn't matter, different religions, different sects, different groups, and all this kind of stuff. And one decides I'm superior to another. And I will cut through that forever. That the same song I will sing is that there's no such thing. There is no such thing. But yes, there is, because we create it. We make it like that. And we wonder why the world is in such turmoil. And yes, maybe it's an idealistic view. But I'm going to say one thing. When I'm on the ground, if someone needs help, I do not ask them or check what their race is, nationality, ethnicity, and all that kind of drama. Because a human being needs food. I've also been in the situation where I've slept under the bridges of Johannesburg in the middle of winter with the homeless. I've done that personally. I've been in a situation where I had no food in my house and I didn't know how I was going to feed my family the next day. How would I have felt if someone came and checked my religion first, checked my race first before they helped me eat food and gave my children food? Or someone come and checked whether I'm the right race or the right religion or belong to the right culture before I was taken out from under the bridge, sleeping in the middle of winter. And that's why I will fight that to my death.
Thank you so much to you, Imran. And that brings us to the end of this Al-Ikhlas Academia Library webinar, Lebanon, a Nation in Turmoil. And as we've heard from our panelists, a huge challenge facing Lebanon. So on behalf of Al-Ikhlas Academia Library, I want to thank our guests, Imran and Hussein Chunara from the Africa Muslims Agency, Matshidiso Motswaneng and Naim Jina from AMAC, for sharing the insights. And also thanks to our media partners, ITV, Voice of the Cape, CII Radio, Salam Media, and Muslim Views, the print partner. Special words of gratitude. I speak here on behalf of our chairperson, or the chairperson of Al-Ikhlas Academia Library, Dr. Ilyas Parker. And Dr. Ilyas Parker wants to express his gratitude to the team and the funders who have made this and previous webinars possible, and appreciation to all the patrons and donors who have enabled, through their continuous support, the functioning of the library. Of course, like everyone else, the pandemic has posed huge challenges, but in spite of those challenges, the library repurposing itself to reach its audience, and that is only possible through the support of the patrons and donors. So a special word of gratitude comes from the chairperson of Al-Ikhlas Academia Library, Dr. Ilyas Parker. From my side, I thank you for joining us, engaging, and I greet you. Those, I can't say, if you're on the road, you're not supposed to be on the road. You're supposed to be at home, because in a few minutes' time, or less than an hour's time, there's going to be a curfew. But I will have to hit the road, so I will bid farewell. I say assalamu alaikum, fi amanillah, take care, stay safe.